I have found a way. I have found a way to torture people. I have found a successful way to introduce a new form of torture for the CIA, and that is to introduce them to the show Virgin River.
Okay. I'm going to try and forget
Virgin River. So it's a show that I can overhear my girlfriend listening to right now. It is basically a Hallmark movie in show form on steroids that I have the displeasure of having to watch sometimes. And it may be the worst thing ever filmed and produced and put on a streaming platform of all time. It is cringy, every single moment of it. And I want to jump out of my third story apartment whenever it's on. It is that bad. I think it is a new form of torture that they can introduce in Guantanamo Bay. But yeah,
understood.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdeljabbar. Man, I almost just mispronounced your name after all these years. But what's up, brother? Glad that you're back from Puerto Rico.
Chilling, man, as per usual. Glad to be back. It's been an interesting couple of weeks.
So, how was your trip?
It was fun. For those of you who may not know, I'm half Puerto Rican, so I have family out there. So part of this vacation was obviously just the ability to go out and be with family and stuff like that and have a little vacation. But the main reason why we're out there is because my girlfriend and I are interested in moving to Puerto Rico. We're looking to purchase our first home there for a number of reasons. One of them is, of course, the weather. It's beautiful there. Another is that I can work remotely, which is great. There are some tax incentives, but I don't really apply for many of them. But just overall, it's a really cool place. So we wanted to get down there and kind of check it out and get the lay of the land and figure it out. And dude, the housing market in Puerto Rico is insane. It's kind of insane everywhere, really. If you're looking to buy a house right now, it's pretty nuts. But it was absolutely insane, man.
So as insane as it's very expensive?
Well, yeah, everything's a little bit high priced, but, coming from New York, everything that would be high priced for everywhere else in the country kind of feels like doable, Yeah, I think New York kind of ruins you for, cost of living where, $300,000 doesn't sound like so much anymore,
Yeah, I know what you mean, man. I was just in Chicago and people were telling me about either the rent they pay or how much they're paying for a place there. And I'm like, that's bad, but you don't really know what's bad until you hit either New York or San Francisco. San Francisco it might be a little bit worse than New York. But yeah, it's interesting, Danny, that I guess I'm the libertarian half of this podcast, and usually it's like the libertarians that go to Puerto Rico for the tax incentives, like so they don't have to pay federal income tax, and they're like, well, you can't vote, and they're like, well, I don't give a fuck, I don't care, I don't vote anyway. I'll just stay.
I'm not going there for the tax reasons, and also just to be clear for everybody, you don't just move to Puerto Rico and suddenly you don't have to pay Uncle Sam anymore. There's a lot you have to do to make sure that you do it, but one of the big ones is Sue, if you're listening, boy named Sue, cryptocurrency, no capital gain tax on them, which is pretty cool. Obviously there's some things you have to prove that you're a resident there, and you have to live there for a little while, and yada yada. But once you get all that squared away, and it's not too ridiculous, you can get away with no capital gains taxes. A lot of rich people are going there for obvious reasons, and a lot of libertarians are going there. I'm just going there because it's beautiful and it's cheaper than New York, and why the hell not? But the market is nuts because there's no inventory, meaning there's as soon as a house goes on the market, it's off the market immediately. But then the process by which you try and get this home is the Wild West. It's people don't often have their deeds. Sometimes the house isn't technically owned by the same person you're buying it from. Sometimes you buy the structure and you can sell the structure, but you don't own the land underneath it. It's super wild, super weird. Everything is unique. Everything is crazy. But yeah, it's been fun, and fingers crossed I find something nice, and maybe I'll be broadcasting from there.
Well, very cool. All right, so it's been 2 weeks since we put out our last episode, and I guess what we're trying to do is catch up on the news, because I guess since we both been traveling, and I haven't really been paying too much attention to a lot of things going on. So using this episode as a way to collect myself and kind of figure out what has been going on in the world over the past 2 weeks. And I don't know where we should start. Like, do you want to talk about Afghanistan first and start going into some other topics?
Yeah, totally. And I think where I want to start with Afghanistan, and this is kind of a strange transition, but I was bitching about the housing market in Puerto Rico, but I have this one story that I think would be a really interesting way to kick off what's going on in Afghanistan, and it starts with an Air Force major who tried to sell his home and lost his life as a result. So as much as I bitch about my experiences with the housing market, there's nothing as bad as losing your life over it. So I don't know if you're aware, Henry, that this article actually came to us from one of our Patreon members. Shout out Stanislav. But it's interesting. Apparently, Afghanistan pilots are being assassinated by the Taliban as the U.S. is withdrawing. And the story goes for this one particular one. This comes from Japan Times, believe it or not. So this Afghanistan Air Force major, his name is, I'm going to butcher it, Dagastir Zamaray, I think. The story goes that basically he was in a neighborhood that he felt uncomfortable with. He felt unsafe. He was getting a lot of death threats from ostensibly the Taliban, right? So this guy decides all right, I'm going to sell my house and I'm going to try and use that money to move to a safer area, kind of near the capital. And this is like a legitimate thing because apparently, the Taliban is offing all of these Air Force pilots. And so one day he goes to meet up with his prospective, his real estate agent, who he knew, right? And they were like tight. It was legit. But, the real estate agent calls him up and says, hey, we're having a prospective buyer who's interested in the home. Like, why don't you come meet me at the office? So the dude, the Air Force major, he goes with his son over to the office. The son tagged along, and they get there, and instead of a buyer, it ended up being a gunman. And pretty much right then and there, without a word, this gunman shoots the real estate agent in the mouth and kills him. And the Air Force major goes to pull his sidearm out because apparently he was strapped at the time, fire back, and gunman already caught the drop on him. He shot him in the head, and he pretty much died immediately. And the son survived. He was a 14-year-old kid, but the father obviously died in his arms like that. And obviously he's real fucked up about it. But this story is kind of interesting because I think the implications of it is pretty fascinating. There's another story pretty similar. This dude Masood Atal, who was a Black Hawk helicopter pilot, and he was on his day off, just kind of chilling, driving around. This was December 30th, so at the end of last year. And he went to go buy fruits apparently for his mom when two motorcycles kind of pull up on him on both sides, and the people in the backseat of those motorcycles just start opening fire on him in his car. Apparently, the dude got shot 11 times, so it was once in the face and 6 times in the right arm and the hand, and the rest of them were in his chest, and obviously he died. But apparently the guy had been getting several death threats from the Taliban, and there was one particular call and voicemail, I think it was, that, dude was cursing him out and saying we're going to kill you, and things like that. And apparently Atal, the helicopter pilot, had asked the government for support and help. Apparently he was asking for bodyguards, a bulletproof car, something, to help protect him. But the military turned him down, and the family of this guy is accusing the government of being pretty weak on this particular matter. But I find this really interesting because in total, 7 pilots in Afghanistan, including the 2 people that we just talked about, have been assassinated off base in the last couple of months. And obviously officials are pretty much saying that this is like a deliberate effort by the Taliban to destroy, military assets, and it's a very valuable military asset because the Taliban doesn't have an air force, right? So it takes a long time to train a pilot. Like, you don't just get in a plane and fly around. Like, it takes months, years, really, to get good at what they do, and they're trained by the U.S. and NATO. And so they're offing them. They're killing them all. And, it has a dual effect. One, it's like very hard to replace a trained pilot in the Air Force. So once one dies, it's like kind of tough to get another one, especially now that we're pulling out and we don't have all those training abilities, readily available to them. But also it has a dual effect because it starts to scare the rest of them, right? So a lot of them are actually leaving the Air Force and leaving the country in some cases. And the Taliban are currently doing all these ground offensives, and they don't have an air force, and they might have some access to like anti-air weaponry, but for the most part, air superiority is going to dominate on this field. And if they have the ability to do close air support or transport troops or just bomb the shit out of people, bomb the shit out of the Taliban, that kind of puts the Afghanistan army, as weak as they are, in a bit of a competitive edge. But now the Taliban are actually looking at disabling that or crippling that advantage. Apparently, according to a UN report, 229 civilian deaths were caused by the Taliban in Afghanistan in the first 3 months of 2021, and 41 civilian deaths were caused by Afghanistan Air Force over the same period. And in that same period, on Sunday, just this past Sunday, more than 1,000 Afghanistan security personnel actually fled Afghanistan to Tajikistan. And apparently about 300 of them have come back, but I don't think all of them are coming back. So this like PSYOP, I guess it is, or like these series of assassinations are actually kind of working in Afghanistan's favor. It's pretty fascinating shit.
Well, it makes sense if you want to equalize the playing field. You'll take out the assassins, because I would imagine there's going to be a much smaller budget to train these pilots, and they're going to have a lot less training available. And I hear those Black Hawk helicopters, they're difficult to train. They're
very.
The Afghan government already doesn't really have the personnel to either fly those planes or helicopters, and maintain them. And also, I hear they have. I've read they've had trouble flying in a lot of the altitudes in Afghanistan. They don't, like, those Black Hawks don't really handle
it's much more difficult. Yeah,
altitudes, like the old Russian helicopters, what they're used to, were better suited for that. But hey, man, Lockheed Martin owns Seleski, the company that makes those helicopters.
Yeah.
So they'd be more than happy to sell them. And we actually just sold as a departing gift to the Afghan government. We gave them about like 37 or so helicopters. Comes out to like $450 million.
No big deal. Small token.
Yeah, more of a gift to Lockheed Martin before the war is over, like a little bit of a severance pay or something like that. But
so what was it, like 30? You said 30 something Black Hawk.
I think it was 30. I think it was around 37 helicopters or so, 37 or 47
for $450 million, right?
Yeah, they were like $12 million a piece. These helicopters.
Nice.
Yeah,
and there's always, of course, going to be like you don't just get a helicopter and it's like, okay, cool, great, I have a helicopter. It's like, all right, now how do you maintain the helicopter? How do you train on the helicopter? How do you fuel the helicopter? Right? There's like all these ancillary costs associated to them, and I'm sure Lockheed is more than willing to provide those services for a cost.
Oh yeah, and helicopters is pushing helicopters has always been a big scandal in the military. There's a lot of helicopter scandals throughout like the military industrial complex's history, especially like in the Vietnam era, but also in the Afghan era. But I guess it all makes it better that we seem to be progressing ahead of schedule as far as the withdrawal. And the experts are saying that we should be out by August. They were saying July previously, but it looks like were going to be out almost completely by August, before the September 11th withdrawal date that we set. And for the life of me, I do not get why they decided to make September 11th the final day to be in Afghanistan. Like, why would you give your political enemies the ammo?
Yeah.
Like, are you serious?
It's it's the 20th anniversary, but like what PR blunder is that, you know? It's like the U.S. lost in 2001, September 11, and we lost again in 2021, September 11, 20 years apart.
Man, I have zero clue why or who thought that was a good idea. Like, just make it September 1st. Make it August 30th or 31st. I can't remember if August has 30 or 31 days, or any other day of the year. But no, they went with a politically charged date. But I don't understand how lizard people. I don't understand the lizard brain as well as the human brain. So I guess that is something
maybe there's some significance there. Yeah.
But I guess a big sign is General Austin Miller. He stepped down, which is a pretty serious gesture that this is all real. You know, we began this podcast talking about the assassination attempt on General Miller. Man, that's almost 3 years ago at this point, or 2.5 years ago at this point, when the Taliban almost got him on an inside attack, but they actually got one of the best Afghan generals, General Razik. But I mean, the war was over long before 2008, but I mean, that is a huge symbol that they can get that close to a general and assassinate him, which is just crazy. Another serious gesture is that we just left Bagram Air Base. And people are so jaded.
That's so huge.
Yeah, people are so jaded that nobody thought that was ever going to happen, but it did. And it turns out that the military could do a speedy withdrawal from Afghanistan after all. Like, wasn't it supposed to be a logistical nightmare?
I always thought that was bullshit.
Yeah, because every single time someone's like, well, we need to get out of Afghanistan. Yeah, we have to do it over time because it's just going to be a logistical nightmare. They withdrew from Bagram Air Base really quick. Granted,
like a couple of days, yeah.
They left a lot of shit behind. They destroyed a lot of stuff.
Right.
It probably pissed off a lot of local scrap sellers, but, they were just pretty much just marched right out. So I guess
I mean, I do know that, like, operationally you do have to secure your route out, right? Because when you're leaving like that, when you're pulling out, you have there's a risk that you can get hit while you're leaving. And that is a danger, but that operational risk isn't necessarily, this is going to take us 10 years to get out, kind of thing. The thing that extends the withdrawal is not, some logistical issue. It's a military industrial complex issue where they want to milk it for as long as humanly possible.
Yeah. Bagram Air Base has been there for 50 years, but, these institutions, 50 years it was a Soviet base first, but these bases that are created, these huge mega bases that are created there, I mean, they're permanent fixtures. It's hard to just, delocate the infrastructure, undo it, just all the jobs on the line. But I guess now air support will operate out of the Gulf states like Qatar and the UAE, and then we have aircraft carriers as well in the Arabian Sea that could do that. But there was actually some air. There was an air. We're recording on Thursday, the 22nd, I believe. So there was actually a airstrike today on the Taliban. From the U.S. There's a peace treaty right now where, we're not technically supposed to be fighting the Taliban, but I guess in the treaty it's for defensive measures and things like that. I don't know the exact, legal pretexts or legal justifications they have, but there was an airstrike today that I guess didn't. What were you saying?
I was just going to say, well, even if what we're doing is probably not legal either, and like we would care anyway,
It's not like the Taliban. I think the Taliban are going to be patient and be like, all right, well, I guess we're just going to have to. We'll just try to wait and see. It seems like they are. They've made enough gestures to us that it seems real. So, it would be foolhardy to go to war again with the United States right now.
Right when they're about to leave.
Yeah, right when they're about to leave. So they probably have some wiggle room when it comes to some tolerance right now to a little bit of some airstrikes. Right. I mean, they've been tolerating it basically for 2 decades. I guess they can tolerate it for maybe another month or so.
A couple more weeks, yeah.
A couple more weeks.
And yeah, totally. And all they really got to do is just run out the clock, basically. Take a knee, run out the clock.
Yeah. But now there's 650 troops are going to be there remaining. That's what's going to be left to protect the embassy in Kabul, which I'm sure that's enough to protect the embassy, 650 troops. But
probably
that's not an occupying force.
No, not even close.
That it's not a force that could fight the Taliban, especially now since the Taliban is the strongest since before the invasion in 2001. And I've been reading a lot of Long War Journal, and I've been just watching these guys freak out over the past couple of weeks. So Kandahar City, the capital of Kandahar province, it's about to be put under siege. At least last time I read it. Things are changing on the ground so quickly that this may be completely irrelevant by the time this is released. But Kandahar City is the second biggest city in Afghanistan, and it's the traditional seat of power for the Pashtuns. And according to the Long War Journal, the Taliban now threatens 16 out of 34 provincial capitals, while 18 of the provinces in their entirety are under direct threat of falling under the Taliban. Now, what makes this real significant is since April, the Taliban have tripled the number of districts under their control, from 73 to 221 in just 3 months.
That's nuts. That's fast.
So, since Biden, and this is what the Hawks are saying right now, they're like, look what Biden did. He ruined everything. Since Biden announced that we were leaving, for sure, because, it was kind of up in the air. Trump said that we were leaving, and then Biden won the election.
And then Trump left.
Like, what is Biden going to do?
Yeah.
And then once he said he was leaving, this all started to really escalate. And now the Hawks are saying, we were about to win, but if only we just held on for another 20 years. We could have done it. We could have made it. We could have made Afghanistan it could have been like Saudi Arabia. Because that's what they were saying. When they were saying these fantasies, well, not the fantasies after 2001, the fantasies before 2001, they were like, because we used to support the Taliban, or we used to, not only in the war against the Soviets, like during the Civil War, the Clinton administration used to, be on the side of the Pashtun plurality in the Civil War against the Northern Alliance. And, they were, a lot of the kind of crazy neoconservative types were like, like the Taliban can make a country like Saudi Arabia a great ally, and, they'll be able to protect our interest, and blah, 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 blah. These people are nuts. But what the Taliban is doing is that they're taking over rural districts, and they're using those districts to, recruit and resupply, and then eventually, push closer to their population centers. And many of the units the U.S. military trained and supplied for years are just surrendering. And they're just handing over all of their hardware. Sometimes the Taliban may or they might execute, I wouldn't say assassinate, it's not the right word. They may execute the commander, but then they'll say, hey, you guys want to fight, run, or join us. And then, they don't have to do these mass executions because, I don't think the Afghan security forces really have the will or the desire to die for what? Afghan, like this kind of constructed nation that's really just a total invention of kind of Western fantasy imperial state building projects. No, they don't care. And the time frame that keeps being pushed out is 6 months. So 6 months until the Afghan government completely falls. Sounds familiar, right?
6 months is always the bomb.
Why is 6 months always used? But 6 months sounds like it could be real. Like I don't know
that for this particular case, yeah.
I'm by no means an expert on anything, but especially not Afghanistan. I have zero clue how fast the Afghan government will collapse. It certainly seems that the Afghan government, as we know it, is going to collapse in the foreseeable future. Like not 5 years. Like
that's what everyone thinks.
Within the year, this thing is going to collapse. It's going to collapse hard. And there's no doubt.
Gamblers are betting on this. Like, what are the odds?
Really? I'm sure there are. What are the odds? How fast? The over the under 3 months until I guess the bet would be until there's no, government in Kabul. But then, what would happen is that there would be some type of loophole in gambling because some guy would be like, oh, the real government is in this hotel in Pakistan, or this real, that's the real government.
Yeah.
Kind of like Hadi, who's the president of Yemen. But he's just like some guy living in a hotel room in Riyadh, but he's the government of Yemen.
Right.
But no, he's not actually
the government incarnate. Yeah.
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 But there's no...
no, and I think most people are positing that the government will fall, but it won't be held by like just the Taliban. I don't think that's going to be a thing either. I think it'll fracture into multiple regions like it probably should have been to begin with.
Hopefully. That sounds like the most peaceful way for it to happen. It becomes fragmented out and there not be one group dominating the other group, because that just sounds like a recipe for disaster. But you got to remember that the Taliban do a much better job at fighting in their country because that's their turf, but they're gonna have the same the same issues as any other occupying force has had in Afghanistan for the past forever. It's still very rugged, very mountainous. It's still underdeveloped in the sense that like there's not a shit ton of infrastructure that connects everything to be able to move troops around very easily. And the Taliban in particular aren't trained in particularly modern warfare, so they're limited to ground and guerrilla warfare, right? And that can only get you so far. So keeping control like of a country that size and that remote would be very difficult. Well,
for one,
the North, I'm talking about they're going to be able to have almost complete control in the South and the East in the Pashtun dominant areas. In the northern areas, the Tajik areas, I don't think they might get slayed if they go to an urban center there and try to impose their will. But what I'm saying that is probably best if there was not any ethnic group dominating the other ethnic group, because that never ends up seeming to work out really well. Like hopefully there's not a brutal and bloody war when the U.S. goes, which is certainly a huge possibility. It's been a very violent place for the past 4 decades. It may be awful for the people who live in Afghanistan. And it really does feel like the fall of Saigon moment. When you have American collaborators hanging on to helicopters to escape. A lot of these interpreters are going to be killed. It's actually surprisingly very difficult for these people to get visas to the U.S. I remember one of the first when I had the first Kindle I got, a book called The Interpreters was preloaded onto the Kindle, and it was just about Afghan interpreters and how hard it was for them to get visas.
Really? That was the book that they preloaded, or did they just know you?
No, this was many, many years ago. This was probably almost 10 years ago. Whenever the Kindle first came out, I got one, and that was the book that was preloaded onto it. It was strange, but unless I subconsciously bought it or something in my sleep by accident.
You from the future went back in time and bought it for you on your Kindle.
Yeah.
Preloaded it so that you can read it and get into geopolitics and start pro history. See, that we uncovered it. That's what happened, man.
Well, I read this book, way before there was any idea of bro history and podcasting about this stuff. But it was
it was the spark.
Yeah, it was a book about. Yeah, maybe that was the spark. It was just all about how hard it was for interpreters to get visas and how much danger they were in.
Right.
Which just sucks. If they're putting their life on the line, I think that they should be able to get into the country. You can't just say, all right,
they're doing us a service. Mm-hmm.
Well, good luck to you and your family. Thanks for your service.
Figure it out.
Here's $2,000 and bye. We'll give you the same amount of money that we gave for bailouts to our citizens. $1,400 or $1,600, whatever. I forget how much they gave.
It was like $1,200, and there was $1,400, and there was another $600 for a plus up.
It changed many lives for the better. It really helped our population out. So the Taliban are bastards. They really don't have much of an issue with killing civilians. And, the reason why people are saying we need to stay, or excuse me, why they're saying we need to stay is you can't leave these people out to dry. What's going to happen to women's rights? How many times have you heard that? That's been the justification for the entire war, right? Because, they don't treat, the Taliban don't treat their women good. They oppress them.
Didn't some of our stimulus money go to women's rights in Afghanistan or something like that?
No, they went to women's studies in Pakistan.
Oh, okay. Close.
So just across the border, that's where we were trying to promote women's studies. You can make a really weird argument that, well, actually, it might be a true argument, that the Taliban was a religious movement formed to stop a lot of the rape that was going on against Afghan women and children during the Civil War after the Soviets withdrew. Because after the Soviets withdrew, the Civil War in Afghanistan was just total anarchy, chaos, blood, and craziness. What happened with the Soviet Union was way worse than what happened with the United States as far as the war and, hopefully the aftermath. The Civil War that precedes the actual occupation doesn't get as bad as the Civil War that preceded the Soviet occupation. The Soviet occupation, they killed about 1 million Afghans. They lost about 30,000 soldiers or so. The U.S., I think they may have killed hundreds of thousands, or at the very least, I'm being very, very conservative if I say tens of thousands, but it's probably in the hundreds of thousands of civilians. But we've only had 2,500 U.S. troops, and I think with coalition troops, there was 3,500 who died, and I guess contractors, they're in that number. It's not nearly, the casualty rate wasn't nearly as high as the Soviet Union, or the cost wasn't. So, but the Civil War that
the blood
preceded,
cost wasn't as high. Yeah,
that preceded was just anarchy and craziness and horror and mass, just very vile, ugly, bloody chaos. And that's why the Taliban rose to prominence, because they were establishing order. And one of the things they did, a big problem there was child rape. Child rape was a really big problem in Afghanistan after the war. And the Taliban would go in and they'd find these rapists and they'd hang them. They'd hang them on construction platforms. You just type in Google, you'll find those images. They would just take, they would hang these child rapists. They're like the QAnon crew. the Afghan version of it.
The Afghan HQ.
T. But that's why they were popular, because maybe you don't like super conservative societies, but most likely you're gonna dislike, child
rapists more. Exactly.
And also, you can make this argument as well that the Taliban are kind of like a bunch of Alyssa Milanos compared to the customs of the old Pashtun villages. Like, these villages that are so isolated, they still basically live in like a 10th century society. I mean, they're coming to these villages and like, come on, man, you can't do that anymore. We're in the 18th century now. Come on. You can't stone people for just that. Come on. What are we doing?
We have the printing press now.
So, yeah. So it's a kind of a weird dynamic to think about, but I mean, we're talking about a society, and I'm not trying to shit on Afghan society. I'm just trying to explain the reality is that there's parts of it that are very isolated from the rest of the world that have no idea what the New World is, or what the New World Order is, or what happened after World War II, or anything about 9/11, or what an Arab is, or
the way that what an Arab is.
What an Arab is, what an American is. Like the world is, their village from, mountain from the north, or mountain from the south, or whatever. There was a, man, it's on the name is forgetting me right now, and I feel terrible. But a guy, he's a British intelligence. I heard him on the Scott Horton show, and he was telling him the way that I had to explain why we were there to some of these villagers was that there was an Arab who flew a plane at a building in a village named New York. A village named New York.
A village.
So these people had
the West Village.
no idea what New York City was, or that New York City sat on top of, was New York City is the capital of the world. NATO is headquartered in New York City. They have no idea about this New World Order that was created after World War II. They probably didn't really know what World War II was. That's how isolated and in the boondocks some of these societies are. And they're like, well, what the hell does this have to do with us? Like, what does this have to do with, like, why are you here?
I'm just trying to herd my goats here.
Yeah,
dude.
just like, what? But I guess to go back, I don't think women's rights will be a top platform for the Taliban.
Not this time around, probably. But, unless mass rape happens again, maybe.
Yeah. Well, despite, the potential horror show that may happen, that may be likely to happen in terms of a civil war, and, despite how tragic that will be, this decline with all these districts and the decline in this government is just proof that we needed to get out of there. 20 years has proved that we can't even prop up the government, let alone, create a stable monopoly on violence in the country. We've spent $2 trillion on this project, and we fail to even really account on how the money was used half the time. We'll be like, hey, we just spent $100 million on a STEM center for young girls so they can learn math and science. And then that STEM center ends up, or that school just ends up being like a tent with a desk in it. Oh, yeah, it was $100 million. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Look at these schools that we made. It's just all just horse shit. And yeah, like the deaths of the massive amount of death that has taken place. And I think it was really just dumb to think that we could pull this war off. And, I'm going to parrot Scott Horton because, I read his books on Afghanistan, his book on Afghanistan and listen to a lot of the experts on his show, and kind of like my main hub of research or material for this is that his book is Fool's Errand. It's a great book. He always says, Afghanistan is the size of Texas. It's landlocked north of Pakistan, and it has deserts like California and mountains like Colorado. And then, what he's saying is that it's just very rugged, untamable land. And you may be able to occupy Kabul for 2 decades, but it's impossible to pacify the countryside, which is the majority of the country. And in addition to the terrain, we're talking about that. And just to give some background, you're dealing with all these different tribal cultures and ethnicities. You have the Pashtuns in the east and the south, who are the largest ethnic group. The major tribes in the north, you have the Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Hazaris. The Hazaris are Shiites, who are also a different religious sect. So, not only are they a different ethnicity, but they're a different religion. And Afghanistan, they're basically just separate nations in different parts of the country. So what the U.S. did was they used different ethnic groups to dominate and occupy the plurality, Pashtuns in the south, and they tried to impose a minority coalition on the largest ethnic group. So this may have worked in Iraq because, Iraq's situation was we removed the Sunni secular dictator and replaced them with the Shia, more religious, chauvinist types who are friendly with Iran. So it kind of backfired on us. But at the very least, that government still stands to this day, because it's still, I mean, as corrupt as it is, it still stands to this day, that government. It was able to withstand the Sunni insurgency that happened after the war, after the U.S. invasion in 2003. And the reason why they were able to withstand is because they gave the power to the majority group, the Shias of Iraq, the majority group. And, the Shia of Iraq were able to get their people in power and government was because they voted for them. They voted for them, based off, their sectarian preference. I don't think, the platform wasn't like, well, what do you think of capital gains tax, or, what do you think? What do you think should be the? We'll talk about different tax brackets, or tribalism. What they're voting for is, oh, you're going to give preference to my sex, my religion. Okay, I vote for you. That's basically how voting for a sectarian leadership or a ethnic leadership works. You're like, oh, you're going to vote for the either
help my group,
ethnic or religious favoritism. You're helping our group, and what that does is you may get power doing that, but it also forces the other groups to band together, and you get this cycle that's very vicious in parts of the world, especially in both of the countries that we decided to invade in the early 21st century for reasons that no one really is able to explain still, or at least anyone from government is able to explain. And, to go back, we never had to fight this war. Even after September 11th, this is where you can argue, like, well, we had to go and get bin Laden. After September 11th, the U.S. didn't have to invade Afghanistan. I was saying this before. The Clinton administration supported the Taliban along with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan back in 1996. They wanted to see a Taliban victory over the Northern Alliance, so mainly because of pipeline security. But after 9/11, the Taliban offered to give bin Laden up to any Muslim nation if we provided proof that he was involved in the September 11th terrorist attacks. They said that they would give them up to any Muslim country And we have Muslim allies. I mean, how many countries could we have transported them to? Who could have picked them up? Like Syria was over there. I mean, we were allies with Syria at that time, and what Assad was doing for us back then was just torturing people. That was like our torture guy.
Right. That was our
friend who would torture people for us. So they would have extradited him back to us. There's Malaysia, there's Pakistan. They said they would turn him over to the Pakistanis. They would have extradited him. But I think after we bombed them, they said that they would give him to any country besides the United States or Israel. And then, they would just be extradited back to the United States. So we decided to just say, okay, we're not negotiating with you. We're not negotiating.
We don't negotiate with terrorists.
We don't negotiate with terrorists or Muslims. That was it. It wasn't terrorists.
People
we don't negotiate.
Harbor and give. What was it? People who
harbor terrorists. We don't negotiate with people with funny hats. That was basically their motto. And I think that the Bush administration never wanted to get bin Laden because that would end the war. Do you remember, if we were kids back then, it's a long time ago, but remember when the news was telling us that we were hot on bin Laden's trail, but then suddenly we were told the trail went cold? So
right,
Delta
like he
Force
disappeared in the mountains somewhere. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Delta Force had him pinned down in Tora Bora, which is true. Delta Force had bin Laden pinned down at the Battle of Tora Bora. But the Bush administration refused to commit the available ground forces to seal off the border of Pakistan and prevent him from escaping. And there was like,
find him.
Yeah. And we had a lot of resources to seal that border up. There were Army Rangers in the Bagram Air Base, like 100 miles away. And James Mattis had even said he had 4,000 Marines. He was in Kandahar, and he claims that he had permission. I mean, he didn't have permission. He requested permission to join the fight, but he was denied. So what I think is that the Bush administration had the chance to get him, and they said, no, if we get him now, we won't be able to link him with Saddam Hussein. We won't be able to link him with Saddam and get our war with Iraq. Like, what are we doing this for? We're doing this to have perpetual war and enrich our buddies. We're not doing this to make the world safe. Like, the hunt, it's over. The scheme is over. The boondoggle is over. We can't get him now. We need this guy to get support. We need this guy to have support for our wars that we want to wage. And that is, I think that really is the story of what happened. It's not like, and even, if he went into the, to the border of Pakistan, and this is what Scott Horton said, and I was dying. He's like, even if they went to the border of Pakistan, it's not like they went into hyperspace and you couldn't catch them, like in Star Wars, when like the the big Imperial cruiser is about to get, they're about to get the Millennium Falcon, and it's like, oh, we got it, and then whoop, and they escape just before Darth Vader is able to blast their ship into the asteroid. It's not like they have that technology where they're going into hyperspace. They're just
maybe they do.
walking the border, going on the border. Yeah, maybe they have that UFO technology.
Yeah, right. They've got that good shit.
Like, why
anti-gravity?
Don't we have a good relationship with Pakistan, or at least on the surface? Don't we have a good relationship with Pakistan?
Mm-hmm.
But I think the truth is that we really just wanted to keep that war going. What do you think?
I think what's funny about what you said is if you listen to it out of context, it kind of sounds a little bit like a bit of a conspiracy theory. Like, why would the U.S. like intentionally What would the Bush administration intentionally not go and catch the guy? But it's like all of the evidence that we see here, that we've been getting kind of slowly over the last 20 years is just confirming and reconfirming everything that you're saying. This isn't like some crackpot theory. It's just pretty obvious at this point. And yeah, it's just a way to enrich the military industrial complex. They're the real winners in this whole war. Wasn't the Afghanistanis. It wasn't us. Certainly wasn't us, because I think the Biden's press secretary recently said something really stupid. The way that they're describing this is the war in Afghanistan has not been won militarily.
But it's been won in our hearts.
Right. The real war was the friends we made along the way.
Everyone who participated was the real war was won by everyone who learned this valuable lesson.
Right.
Well, we learned a valuable... No. What a way to pitch it. Hey, Biden actually is in a position to... Well, he's actually in a pretty good position to do this, and that's why he is doing it.
Right.
Because
now it's abundantly clear.
And second of all, he was kind of like a reasonable voice when it came to a lot of these issues in the Middle East to Obama. So even if you can be like, well, Barack Obama escalated the war in Afghanistan, which he very well did. Obama did escalate the war in Afghanistan. Biden was one of the only people who was like, this isn't really a good idea. You shouldn't listen to the generals. So I think that Biden has a little bit more, I guess, experience to deal with generals and say, no, I'm not doing this. Just think about Biden. He's been burnt so bad by experience when it comes to foreign policy, as far as his, getting being the whip to get Democrats to vote for the Iraq War, and that eventually leading to ultimately the death of his son, which is really sad. It was his son got cancer because he was stationed in a burn pit. So I think that kind of regret looms over him and makes a lot of his foreign policy decisions more sober. So he's able to do that. And honestly, it's just the public agrees. It's not an unpopular opinion with the public. It may be an unpopular opinion with generals in the Pentagon or weirdos. Like, only a weirdo at this point was like, well, we need to stay in there for our integrity along the world, and we're going to lose credibility around the world if we continue to stay in Afghanistan.
You know what they're saying now, those weirdos? Those weirdos, I was watching Fox News recently, and they had this guy on, and I don't know who the fuck this guy was. I don't know what his credentials were, but he was basically saying, like, yeah, we should totally get out of Afghanistan. Nobody thinks we should be in Afghanistan. But what we should be doing is taking all those troops and redeploying them to other areas all over the world so that we can assert dominance everywhere else. And the way that he was saying it was just such a joke, because it was like he was trying to, on the one hand, say, like, war bad. And then on the other hand, say, let's make war everywhere else. And it was just such a face palm. I'm like, dude, what are you even saying? Like, he's acting like he's woke for being on the let's pull out of Afghanistan thing, and in the same sentence is proposing that we then turn around and maybe put them in Nigeria, or put them in I don't know, fucking literally anywhere else. You pick a fucking country,
He's like, it's like, come on, Afghanistan is just getting boring. Like, people are tired of this war. Not because of the horrors of it, because of it's immoral, but because it's just not interesting anymore. It's not sexy. There's nothing cool about it.
It's not trending on Twitter anymore.
Like, come on, I think of Patrick Tillman when I think of Afghanistan, and that just makes me sad because he played football. Come on, we gotta do some other war theater.
We gotta do
let's
something
go back
new
to jungle
and fresh.
Theme. Come on, jungle theme was fun.
Right.
Let's go to ice theme, guys. Let's do an ice theme war. Imagine if that's probably how they think. Like, we need to find a nice war, tundra, to declare our next war. That will be a way to do it. We'll find some Eskimos to that hate each other. We'll try to create a state, and then it'll be great. Come on, maybe there'll be more opportunity as polar
Hey man,
ice
we've been
caps melt and maybe
Dude, we've been escalating on the polar ice caps lately, so this story might actually play out. There's because the northern ice in the Arctic Circle, the ice caps are melting. It's revealing all of this natural resources that's been locked under the ice for God knows how long. Thanks global warming, and now everybody's vying for a position to try and capitalize on it because they're finding shit like natural gases and like gold and like random shit like that. So it's entirely possible that we do find some like Inuit villages.
Do you want to freak out some liberals? Here's what you got to tell them, and this will freak them out. And I bet this is, if you tell them this or if they hear this, then they'll think about it. The main the country that's going to benefit the most out of the melting of ice caps and things like that, of an increase in sea levels, would be Russia, by far, because Russia, all of their capitals besides St. Petersburg are inland. So Moscow is not on the coast.
They're not getting flooded.
Most of their major cities are not on the coast besides St. Petersburg, and they have a lot of natural resources up in Siberia that are covered with permafrost. So they'll have access to all this mineral wealth. It would be good for them as in a geopolitical national way. Yeah, it would be good for them. So if you really want to sell people on climate change, maybe you go like, well, you're benefiting Putin. You're benefiting Putin. Just funny. Just funny.
That's a mind blower right there. That's a mind blower.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, shit. You don't have to be on the coast for it to like destroy shit. Not just in the last 2 weeks, there was like that giant, river flooding in Germany that's killed mad people. So, global warming will hit you wherever you are, just in different ways.
Well, so I want to go back to one more point on Afghanistan, and then let's move to our next topic,
Okay.
which I think will be Cuba. But so a bunch of people. Another reason why people say that we stay. This is like the two reasons that are like, well, we can't go, are women's rights. We can't let them out, leave the people out to dry. And then the third one being like, well, who's going to fill the vacuum? Who's going to fill the vacuum? And everyone knows
ISIS 2.0.
They're not talking about ISIS, really. ISIS doesn't really have that strong of a foothold there. ISIS.
No, I know, but they try to make
Taliban.
it seem like that an ISIS will develop in the absence of American military.
Well, I mean, ISIS is like, those groups in Iraq and Syria are way different than groups in they're completely different customs. Everyone groups Muslims together.
ISIS is I'm just saying, not ISIS, an ISIS, like a militant group. Like
I know you mean.
Decides to like cut people's heads off.
The ISIS in the ISIS in Afghanistan are just like former Mujahideen and Pakistani refugees, but I don't think that would be an issue. What they're talking about more so is what do they give a fuck if people get their heads lopped off? They don't care about that. What they are always insinuating is that China is going to fill that vacuum. So they'll be like, well, China's going to be the great power to invade Afghanistan next. They have. Yeah, God help us. If we really want to take down China as a great power, then let them be number
just let them get into Afghanistan.
5 on the list of empires that decided to meddle in that part of the world. Like, you can go back to every single great empire on Earth, basically. I mean, not everyone. That's being a little facetious, but back to Alexander the Great. Yeah, right. Alexander the Great and the British Empire and the Soviet Union and America, and there's that meme, like graveyard empires. Yeah, sure. Yeah, right. China, go in there. China, go to Afghanistan. Right. Try to pacify the countryside. Yeah, if only they would be so dumb to do that. But they do have at least on a copper mine there, which they haven't really been able to exploit. But China actually is a pretty big, well, was a beneficiary of the U.S. presence there, because we provided them with the security blanket that enabled them to pursue their Belt and Road Initiative across Pakistan and Central Asia. And China has a lot of investments in both Pakistan and Tajikistan, which share borders and then their ethnic tribal links with Afghanistan.
Right. So the implication is that Afghanistan's relative calm is to the benefit of China's business ventures.
Yeah, they are. And then another thing, if you want to get real deep or make the case, is that a lot of the Uyghur Muslims that flee from China, they a lot of them go to Afghanistan. And,
right. Tajikistan and Kazakhstan and Afghanistan are like the popular destinations for them.
And allegedly there's Uyghur militants there. So
that I didn't know. That's interesting. I'm going to have to Google that later.
I mean, there's Uyghur militants, and you can imagine there's probably militant groups out of any refugee group in foreign countries. But who knows? Maybe as U.S. power wanes, the CIA will try to create separatist movements among
a Uyghur insurgency.
Yeah, against, and then also separatist movements and across the different other ethnic groups like the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, and Iran will be there to arm and finance the Hazara minority, which they do already, and Pakistan will continue to quietly support the Taliban. But I don't really think China wants to get too involved in any or I don't think that's something to worry about or to take at face value and be like, oh, China wants to get super involved. All right, you want to keep on talking about Afghanistan, or do you want to move on to
let's
Cuba?
Let's move on. I think we're beating a dead horse now.
Sure.
Cuba. Yeah, man, I was in Puerto Rico, and I got the news that Cuba is apparently on fire. Well, not literally on fire, but there's a bunch of protests happening right now against the Cuban government and, of course, the ruling Communist Party of Cuba. And that started on the 11th, but it's been ongoing. And I think the going story right now is that it was triggered by a shortage of food and medicine in the government's response to, the COVID-19 pandemic, which surprisingly is actually legitimately resurging in Cuba pretty hard right now. Lots of people are dying. They're having like record hospitalizations again, and record death counts again. So they seem to be going in the opposite direction right now, which is very, very sad, very terrible. But what was interesting about these particular riots is that they are the biggest anti-government demonstrations since what was known as the Maleconazo, which happened in 1994. That was a series of anti-government demonstrations and riots that happened as a result of the Soviet Union collapsing. Basically, when that happened, that was like an opportunity for the dissidents for communism to try and pull away from it. But obviously, communism won in that particular fight. And so I started doing a little bit of research on that because I was interested in the kind of the history of this rioting and communism and socialism, generally speaking, in Cuba, just to kind of get little bearings, a little background. So I started reading into the those riots in '94 to kind of see how they compared to today, and I learned a lot. So a couple of things. In '94 there were more than 30,000 people who actually fled the island of Cuba on boats and shit to the United
communists
States.
always trying to tell you what to do. Scarface.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that was the product of the times, you know. So that 30,000 people is a lot of people to like just jump on a little raft, and you know, I mean the closest that Cuba and Florida is, like Key West specifically, is 90 miles, but it's like one little tiny part of it, you know. Most people don't live in that one little tiny part of Cuba and then decide to flee from there. They're fleeing from anywhere on the island. So, you know, in many cases, they're going up to 300 miles on a little raft, you know, trying to find their way over to Florida. And that's a very dangerous, perilous journey. And so I started reading about that because I found that interesting, because it's kind of reminiscent, you know, of at least the rhetoric that's coming out in the media today is reminiscent of like this mass migration scare from, you know, our southern border in Mexico, right? But with like a different flavor, like a different twist. So in '94, around that time, then President Bill Clinton actually enacted what was called the wet foot, dry foot policy. And what this policy was about was it basically gave any refugee of Cuba that like successfully made the journey from Florida to Florida, I should say. It basically gave them the ability to stay in the United States. It's like if you make it, great, you know, you can stay. And then later, it was expanded to, you know, allow for them to get a path to like an expedited legal permanent residency, right? Of course, this was a very special deal that we're working out for you know, Cuban refugees. You know, we don't necessarily extend that same welcome, open arms policy to people who say cross the Rio Grande, you know, fleeing from, you know, gang violence in Honduras. I digress though. But the other side of that was the dry foot part of the wet foot, dry foot policies. Like if you know, make it to dry land, you're good. But the wet foot part of it was that anyone who didn't make it to dry land gets sent back to Cuba. So if they scoop you up in the ocean, they catch you on the way here, they'll bring you to Florida, they'll hold you for a couple days, and then they will either extradite you back to Cuba directly, or they'll send you to a third country. And often it was like Mexico or something.
Unless you can play baseball, then they'll take you.
Unless you can play baseball.
Unless you can throw a 100-mile-per-hour fastball, then you can stay.
Then you can stay. There's a test, and if you pass, then you can stay. And this story, like that kind of, you know, learning about that policy made me think of that one really big story from the mid-'90s. Do you remember that little Cuban boy that was like famous?
Elian Gonzalez?
Yep, that's him. Right. So Elian Gonzalez, short story about this kid for anyone who's either too young to remember that story or just haven't, you know, been hip to it, but it was super, super famous. The short story is that his mom and her new boyfriend, Cuban people, right? They were in Cuba. They basically took him in the night, and, you know, apparently they gave him like sleeping pills so he'd fall asleep or something like that. I don't know how that was relevant to the story, but I remember reading about it. And they get on this little fishing boat that was bound for Florida, and on the way, shit went down. So the boat capsized, and his mom was able to, you know, help him onto this little raft, this like little life raft that was, you know, attached to the back of the boat. She didn't make it. Unfortunately, she died. She was lost at sea. But he did make it, and he was basically floating around for God knows how long in the ocean by himself, until a fisherman found him. And the fisherman was obviously a U.S. fisherman, and brought him back to Florida. And there was this whole, you know, big news story about it, because obviously that's a crazy story, right? You know, poor little kid, you know, gets stuck in this situation. And, you know, in the U.S., they were painting it as like you know, communism is so bad that, you know, this mom had to like flee from communism and take her kid, and she lost her life, but, you know, thank God he survived, you know, and now he's here in the United States, and, you know, go freedom, right? That was like the media story, right? But also part of this is that the kid's father is alive and existed in Cuba. And when they figured it out, like, you know, kid's father wanted him to come home, right? And, you know, the family that Elian Gonzalez had some family in Florida, and that's who he was staying with, you know, in the interim. But the father wanted him to come back, and that family didn't want to give him up. And there was this big, like, national debate about, you know, should we, you know, let him go back to his dad, or should he be an American citizen and stay here, you know, because communism bad, right? ultimately, the father won the legal battle about it, right? And he did get custody. And then there's this famous situation where like the federal agents go and raid the house where he was staying because they had like barricaded it in, like they were like trying to keep him there. And like there's this picture, super famous. If you haven't seen it, like Google Elian Gonzalez raid. And it's just this like federal agent pointing like an assault weapon at the guy holding Elian Gonzalez in a closet.
I remember
it's
that.
So nuts.
I remember that.
So nuts.
I was young. It's like one of my first memories. It's like one of my first news stories I remember as a child.
Right.
Is that.
Right. It was huge. I mean, he's roughly our age. He's grown up now. It was nuts. That was a nuts story. Now, as crazy a story as that is, I think it highlights an issue that's rising today in Cuba, and that's in particular mass migration, or at least the threat of mass migration. Because, from what I've read and heard right now, and frankly seen with my own eyes at this point, because there's so much footage coming out of this situation, is that there's this new generation of Cubans that are like done with communism. They're done with the government. They're like, they've had enough at this point. And now that they have social media and, smartphones and shit and technology, that they have so much better means to organize, and they have so many better ways of getting their story out, right? We're just seeing these videos coming out, and it's pretty nuts, And I mean, there is some criticism about, our media today saying that it's all about the pandemic, which, that's not the whole story. The pandemic definitely sparked this round of conflict. I think if you're ignoring that, you're just not seeing the, some of the catalysts here, because there was a lot of government lockdowns as the entire world went in lockdown. And there was a super shitty response to vaccinations, where the government actually denied importing vaccines and decided to make them themselves, which took forever, obviously. And then obviously they don't have the capacity to produce enough of them to give to everyone. Go figure. It's a communist country. And there's just like an overall shortage of medical supplies, which obviously pissed people off, but also it costs a lot of people their lives. So you can't deny that COVID-19 definitely was a contributor to this. But, a lot of this was a long time coming, This has been... Cuba kind of sucks right now. And I mean that in a loving way, not because I want to shit on Cuban people or anything like that. It's just the country's in shambles. They're in a shortage of everything except for shortages, which is a pun that I am going to own. I was actually watching this video, a Turning Point USA video, which,
oh god,
crazy, right? But I watched it for the lulz because I was just doing a bunch of research, and I'm like, let me just see what these guys have to say. And even though I fervently disagree with that organization on pretty much everything, this particular video was actually kind of informative. I was pretty surprised at it, and it was like a group of bros. It starts off like, the liberal media wants you to think that, Cuba's this beautiful paradise, and we Googled it, and all you can find is these beautiful pictures. So we decided to go to Cuba to see what it was actually like, right? So if you can ignore those parts, actually with the footage in the film that they actually did get a chance to take was pretty interesting. And I'm sure that the video is heavily edited and super biased to prove that their point that socialism sucks. But from what you can see, and the video that they do provide, it's legitimately pretty bad. There's this one scene in that video where they go on, they rent a car or whatever, and there's so many gas shortages, and they get in line for a gas line, and they're like, okay, we're going to show you how long this gas line is. And they pull over to the side and they just drive down this thing. It's like a half-mile long gas line, and there's like people pushing their cars because their cars ran out of gas, waiting on the gas line. And then there's these like footage of like grocery stores as an example. Like they're at this one grocery store. They finally open up the gates of the grocery store, and it's like a Black Friday mob of people that are rushing into this grocery store. And the stores were stocked full of nonsense. Like they had this aisle that was just one brand of mango marmalade cans. It was just like the most useless shit in this supermarket. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that Cubans are probably pretty pissed at their at their living conditions and at the way that their government's being run. And yes, COVID-19 probably didn't help at all. And now they've decided to start protesting about it and rioting, frankly. Can't blame them for what they're doing, but that's how it turns out, when people get frustrated. But we've seen this before, right? So new generation taking to the streets to protest an oppressive regime, wink, wink, Hong Kong, So of course the Cuban government right now is cracking down on this, and in many cases they're injuring protesters. I actually don't recall if anyone has died or not. I'm certain somebody has to have, unfortunately. And but the point is that all of it's being streamed on the internet, right? So think like, as an example, police violence against black and brown people has always been a thing, but it wasn't until we start seeing all these videos all the fucking time of it happening, like George Floyd, that causes a giant, massive protest, right? So same thing in Cuba, right? So it's always been a thing that Cuba kind of sucks for all these reasons that I described before, but now, that we start seeing the evidence of it and they protest against it and you see the government response to it, this causes a giant upheaval in violence and in rioting. And of course, there's the U.S. implications that I mentioned before, right? Because now the Biden administration is kind of under a bit of pressure to do something about it in response. But it's kind of a no-win situation, really. On one hand, it looks like we're placing these new sanctions and embargoes on Cuba. This actually, just today, they came out, just a couple hours ago, that they're going to be putting some new sanctions and embargoes in place on, for Cuba in response to the way that the government had been handling those protests. And I'm not privy on the details yet because it literally just came out, but I read something about how they will hold individuals who violate human rights on the island of Cuba accountable, whatever the hell that means. So, looks like they're doing something, I guess. But the thing is that, the government of Cuba has used mass migration as a weapon in the past. They actually, want to make it bad for these dissidents because they want them to leave. They want them to leave and flee to the U.S. because they know that that's like a logistical and, pretty much everything nightmare for the U.S., right? Mass migration is difficult for the receiving party. And basically they're like, oh great, all of our dissidents get to run away, right? And then you got to deal with our dissidents, and what we're left over with is just all the complacent
Isn't
people.
that what the premise of Scarface is? In the very beginning, they show in Castro, they're basically like deporting all of their criminals, and that's how Tony Montana. Because I honestly don't know very much about Cuba at all. So I'm getting my history from Scarface, but wasn't there? They sent all these people into not refugee camps, but basically kind of like these migrant camps in Florida, and a lot of them got into the drug trade, like Tony Montana.
Yeah, and I think obviously that film, it's been years since I've seen this movie, but like that film like over glorifies or over exemplifies the criminal aspects of the people who fled from Cuba, right? And I don't think that's indicative of the types of people who are legitimately fleeing from Cuba from communist dictators. But what is true about that is that the actual government itself does engage in forced, expulsions of their own people, of their own dissidents. If they're not disappearing people, they're, either threatening their lives or in some cases, as I'm trying to point out, they're making them leave. And the wet foot, dry foot policy is no more, right? I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Obama put the kibosh on that one when he normalized relations with Cuba. That's when we were able to start doing some light travel and like some light trade and stuff like that. Part of the deal was, part of the deal was that we wouldn't accept people as Cuban refugees anymore, just by virtue of getting on land. Unless there was some like credible threat to their lives, which in many cases Cubans can probably prove that. But we don't have that policy anymore where they can kind of just come in. I guess that raises kind of a national question about migration, and in this case it's very much illegal immigration. And what I find kind of very interesting about this is like people like Marco Rubio, who is a Cuban, who is a representative for Florida, right? So it's very astute that he's speaking out about this, because he actually does represent a lot of Cuban Americans. I'm not clear on his position in this respect, and I'm not clear on the right's position in this for this particular issue. Because on the one hand we want to stick it to the communists, on the other hand we don't want immigration, or at least illegal immigration. It's kind of a difficult situation right now.
The right's view on this is, so to them, to the right, they see Cubans as basically Americans who are escaping communism, and they're going to fit right into our society. So give them all to us. They want to live in America. They want to be American. So let's take the Cubans. Cubans vote Republican. I think they're the only Hispanic group to. I'm not sure if it's majority anymore that vote Republican, but they have the largest percentage of conservatives at the very least. They might be the majority conservative. So they're like, hey, we'll take some more conservatives. I think that is their mentality on it. Now, my opinion is, as someone who kind of, at least I see myself as someone who steps out of both political camps. I'm obviously no fan of the Cuban government and their economic systems, and the government they have in place. I don't think it's good, but I also think it's bad to put sanctions on them and embargoes, and it's obviously making things a lot worse. And I think the meddling that we've done in Cuba has been terrible. It's been awful. I mean, yeah, we don't like Fidel Castro, but how many times did we try to assassinate him? Like 130 times or something like that? Something ridiculous.
My favorite is the bomb in his cigars.
Yeah, the bomb, and that's the real famous one. But
yeah,
people forget that Batista was a bastard as well. Like, he was a corrupt oligarch mafia figure who ran that country. Yep. Who was a dictator, and there were extreme amounts of poverty that were going on in Cuba, prior to the communist dictatorship that succeeded it. Usually when a communist dictatorship takes control of a government or takes control of a society, it's because that society had some awful imbalance or some awful wealth disparity that was going on. And that was the case with Cuba. There was an awful wealth disparity going on between, people who were wealthy and connected and people who were dirt poor and obviously would like the prospects of sharing wealth. Now, for the validity of communism as an economic system, as far as dealing with the realities of prices and scarcity, no, it's not going to work. It's always going to end up in disaster. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that you got to understand the reasons why communist governments come to power and come to place. They don't just spring up in kind of normal, healthy nations. It's usually countries with really horrible or really big imbalances of rich and poor. Now, as far as like sanctions, there's no reason to put sanctions on them. There's no reason. And what you're doing and what the right doesn't get, it's like, we need to have the back of the freedom-loving people of Cuba.
Right. That's
when
the
you
line
do
of
that.
argument right now.
So here's what you're doing. You're giving more legitimacy to that system, because they can say, well, it's not the system that's wrong. It's the outsiders. It's the embargoes. It's the sanctions. It's all this stuff. And that's why we're having these economic problems, is because of the outside, which usually... That's
the Iran argument now.
So yeah, like, you're legitimizing the government, and you're also giving them an out. So
Right.
you have normal relationships with them. You have a normal relationship with them. Don't sanction them. That's my position. Like, you don't have to agree with their
But they're
economic
violating
system.
human rights. They're killing people. They're disappearing people. You know, like, are you going to have a normal relationship with, with countries like that?
Well, I'll pull the Trump and do you think we're angels? I mean, what country could have a relationship with the United States government when it comes to killing people? I mean, maybe not as our own. Well, even our own citizens. I mean, just like
we
at
kill plenty of our own
cops that
citizens.
just murder people. Like, look at
Right.
You can make that same, like, all right, I think I've made this argument before. If there was some higher society or higher nation than the United States, and we had to kowtow to someone else, they could take so much shit that we've done and be like, wow, this country is crazy. Like, they are killing people, they're shooting, they're killing all these people, they're blowing up countries near them, they're genociding people. I mean, I wouldn't say genocide, but you could certainly make the argument if you want to condemn them. Mm-hmm. You could make the case to have a very aggressive, hostile foreign policy if you wanted to
Against the United States.
You wouldn't even, and I wanted to say cherry pick, but I mean, you don't even need to cherry pick. You could just be like, oh yeah, look what they did to these other countries. They destroyed them.
Right, and it's not even just the foreign policy; it's also the domestic stuff too. There's plenty of ways to get at us on the domestic front as well.
Look what they're doing to their whistleblowers and their journalists. They're trying to get Julian Assange. They're trying to extradite him from England to prosecute him for just uncovering secrets, and they have basically exiled the whistleblower, and they have a long history of putting journalists in jail. I mean, there's a long history in the United States of putting journalists in jail. I mean, we always talk about, and not just journalists, but whistleblowers. We talk about Daniel Ellsbury, or we have been talking about him a lot lately. I mean, the only reason why he didn't go to jail is because Nixon was insane. And
Nixon fucked up.
Nixon fucked up by burglarizing his psychiatrist's office and, allegedly trying to assassinate him too. And, trying to use the judge, kind of bribe the judge with like a political appointee on the case. So, obviously it was kind of a fraud case, but I mean, that's off the point. Mm-hmm. I just don't think that we should be involved and do anything to them. Just let it solve itself.
I tend to agree with you. I'm going to play the devil's advocate that I'm hearing, from a lot of these, especially right-wing groups. So what if, what's going to happen when, if we don't do something about it? What's going to happen when, Soviet Union, Spetsnaz forces land on the beaches of Cuba to help the government put down the insurrection? What happens if China decides to get more, friendly with them and prop them? Now we've got enemies on our doorstep, blah, blah, blah.
If that's the reality that these right-wingers live in, then, I mean, I don't know where to start. It's going to have to start with like a heavy dose of reality checks. And I mean, I don't even know where to start if that's the mentality. If you think that there's going to be another Cuban Missile Crisis, basically, kind of what they're insinuating, that, oh no, what if China comes in and puts missiles, nuclear warheads on Cuba? I mean, that is not going to happen. And so what if they have trade relations with China? Like, who cares?
Exactly. If it does, it's I hate to say it, but it could be our own, because of our own doing. We've pursued aggressive embargoes and aggressive sanctions on this country, and they obviously have a shitty governmental system that wasn't going to work in the first place. But trust me, those embargoes weren't helping either. It accelerated that by quite a bit, to the detriment of the people that live on the island. And right now they're relegated to doing business with the likes of like fucking Iran and Venezuela and like all the ragtag countries that are kind of outside of the
world
United
order.
States imperial.
They're outside of the world order.
The imperial order.
The imperial order.
So,
they're the bad countries. That's what they're kind of labeled, like, the bad guys.
And if we're saying that we're afraid that these big superpower countries that are kind of outside of that order
superpowers
are gonna
superpower. There's
Russia,
no
you don't think Russia and
superpower
China
country besides the United States.
Well, nuclear armed power, whatever you want to call it, right? And any of these countries, are going to have a greater influence on a country that we've basically put in a box. It's like, of course, like it's. Well, who else are they going to turn to for help? Who else are they going to turn to do trade with? Who else are they going to turn to like, exchange knowledge and information with, when we're basically putting them in a box? We're saying that nobody can talk to these people.
And you know what? That's what led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. We didn't have to isolate Castro and isolate the government that came after Batista. We could have had a decent relationship, but when we have this when we had these antagonistic relationships with these countries because they didn't do something we wanted them to do, then they turned to the Soviet Union. And that's what ultimately happened with a lot of countries in the Arab world, and as well as South America and in Cuba, where they turned to the Soviet Union because that was really their only option. Even Southeast Asia as well. A lot of countries turned to communism because they may have been, maybe the population was looking for something more, more nationalistic, but communism kind of met that hunger. I don't think most people, besides like the super intellects, are really sold on communism. I think the population is more just like, you're looking for some type of national relief, and that kind of fits the hunger. And but I just don't think there's a reason to have these antagonistic relationships with these countries, and certainly not make these extreme calls for, I've heard some people call for military action, which is like, last time we tried that worked really well, right? Remember? I mean, I don't remember personally because I wasn't born yet, but I remember there was a certain bay with, a name of an animal that makes bacon and pork that ended up being a disaster. So don't do that. I think it's dumb to do that, and don't sanction them. Just have a normal relationship with them, and then let their government change on its own. Usually, things change. Look at Vietnam. I mean, Vietnam is still technically, I guess, a communist country, but they're not this crazy nut job. I mean, I think they do have some.
They're not like a
draconian
pariah
laws,
state.
They're not a pariah state. Like, most governments around the world are not just going around murdering people for fun. As much as I hate government, most governments around the world, including our own government, it's not like, who do we want to kill today in our society?
Right, for fun.
I want to kill that new young family with that cute little baby. Ha ha ha, we're the government. Ha 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 ha. Screw you, America. Ha ha ha. We'll kill everyone. Ha ha. There's a scene, there's this really corny Chuck Norris movie that came out in the 80s. Oh, man, I forget what it's called. I remember watching it with my mom when I was young. But this movie is about I think it's about a bunch of Cubans who invade Florida and just start committing terrorist attacks.
What?
Man, I need to find this movie. It is just it's
like a propaganda film?
Oh, well, yeah. All of Chuck Norris movies in the 80s were propaganda films. Cuba Chuck Norris film. I need to find this. It is shocking. Invasion USA. It is. Type that in Google. The art of it is like the most famous picture of Chuck Norris.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I recognize this.
Yeah, and
the two guns shooting
Yes.
Chuck Norris.
There
The
is
two Uzis.
it's about the Cubans. They do like a Normandy style beachhead invasion of like a Florida beach, and they do it at night, and they just start committing terror attacks. And there's a part where this guy is going around like in a drive-by. He's going around different houses in this neighborhood, in this suburban neighborhood, and he has an RPG, and he's launching the rockets into homes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He's launching rockets
like
into
that's
homes.
just the indiscriminate shit that they're just gonna do, right?
And it is just the most absurd film. It is just an 80s film. This is the most 80s thing that has ever been released in that time period. Just this Cuban guy just going house to house, just launching rockets and destroying it's ridiculous. Another childhood memory that came up. I want to watch this just for the sheer, just a throwback to another time. But all right, you want to move on to the final story before I would say Haiti, but I don't know. I'm just so behind on it, and I'm so confused over who killed what and what happened. Have you been following Haiti at all? Time.
Let's do it. Let's do the shorter one, and then we'll end it.
Okay. Yeah, Haiti. I don't even know where to start with Haiti. I don't know who killed this guy. There has been a lot of different suspects. People are saying Colombia, America, China is even being blamed.
China.
I don't know. I need to get someone who knows. We need to get someone who knows what they're talking about with Haiti.
Another time.
But yeah, it's a pretty crazy story.
Pretty interesting story. Yeah.
But I want to talk about this Ben and Jerry's scandal.
Mm-hmm.
This is a scandal we need to talk about. So did you hear about...
I saw... Before you even start this, like I am not up to date on this, and I'm glad that you wanted to talk about this and that you've done a little research on it, because all I saw was it was like a headline, and it said, U.S. tries to put the freeze on Israel-Palestine conflict, but Ben and Jerry's had something else to say about it, and I was like, I can't even read this nonsense. I was like, where the hell does Ben and Jerry's play into this whole story, and how the hell is this even relevant? So please, all right, Henry, enlighten me. What the hell is going on?
This story and why it's a big deal too. Ben and Jerry's announced that it will stop selling ice cream in occupied Palestinian territories. Now, have you heard of the term PEP before?
PEP?
PEP.
P-E-P?
P-E-P.
No. Nope.
So what that stands for is Progressive Except for Palestine. So, progressive. If there's a progressive, and they're progressive on things like the minimum wage and climate change, and all the progressive policies they usually advocate
woke
for.
about everything.
But if they're not supporting the Palestinian plight, then they're called PEP, Progressive Except for Palestine. And Ben and Jerry's, as we know, they've always kind of supported. I think they're supported Bernie Sanders. The owner of Ben and Jerry's is a big progressive, and they're always supporting these policies and these movements. And it's their right. It's their right. I like Ben and Jerry's flavors ice cream, and they have been accused as being PEP for a while. So they've been selling ice cream in the occupied territories, so the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and settlements. And progressives have been complaining about this. They've been saying, hey, you need to take a stand. How do you stand for all these progressive values, yet you are basically accomplices in this brutal occupation with you selling ice cream and not saying anything. So now Ben and Jerry's is taking a stand. They're saying, no, we're done. We can't be involved in this anymore. We're not selling ice cream in occupied Palestinian territories. Here is the real interesting thing that's going on. Israel's ambassador to the U.S. sent letters to the governors of 35 U.S. states that have laws in the books against BDS, saying that, and I quote, that this was the de facto adoption of anti-Semitic practices. And Israel's foreign minister, Yair Lapid, said on Twitter, I have this up, over 30 states in the United States have passed anti-BDS legislation in recent years. I plan on asking each of them to enforce these laws against Ben and Jerry's. They will not treat the state of Israel like this without a response.
Oh, shit.
So these anti-BDS laws that Israel lobbied states to pass, so they're lobbying states to pass them. They lobby state governments too.
Right.
So what they do is that they deny state funds to those who advocate for the boycott of Israel. So some
or
of these
at least
states,
the ones that don't go against boycott, divest, and what's the S in BDS?
if they say sanction, boycott, divestment, sanction. So
Sanction,
if they say that they're supporting, or if they want to do a boycott of Israeli products or things like that, then the state governments has, they can deny them, state funds and subsidies and things like that, or relief funds. Some of these states require state employees to divest their own pensions from companies that boycott Israel. And it also requires state contractors to sign an oath pledging not to boycott Israel. So if you're a state contractor, you have to sign an oath pledging not to boycott Israel. So whose business is it who you boycott? If there's ever a violation of the First Amendment, this is it. And whenever
I understand.
Whenever they're brought to court, they're always ruled unconstitutional. And just kind of think of the gall of a foreign state lobbying your local state that you live in to shut you up if you want to talk about their crimes. Like, imagine if that were China. Like, imagine if China was lobbying your local state and saying, hey, you can't talk about Uyghurs, or you can't boycott because of Uyghur or Hong Kong. But imagine that circumstance. It is insane, the fact that the Israeli government lobbies state governments. It's insane. And now politicians are getting involved and starting to virtue signal their support as well. Bill de Blasio, he came out and he said that he's boycotting Ben and Jerry's.
Wow.
So Bill de Blasio, I guess that's good news for Bill, because another scoop of Ben and Jerry's for Bill will probably give his fat ass diabetes. So I don't think he needs any more Ben and Jerry's. So that might be a good health decision in the long run for de Blasio. But, of course, he had to be, oh, yeah, well, this is anti-Semitic. Ben and Jerry's is an anti-Semitic ice cream now, which they're not. But now, like all these usually this type of behavior is way more. I mean, Democrats are really bad too, but Republicans are just god awful, terrible on this. Like Senator James Lankford out of Oklahoma, he called for an outright ban of Ben and Jerry's in the state of Oklahoma. You can't ban
preventing a private company from doing business.
You can't insanity of that. It is just insane. It is crazy. It is just absolutely nuts. And it honestly is so dumb. It's dumb because it's calling more attention to it. If you're the Israeli government, you want to sweep that under the rug, is not have people talk about that as much as possible. Like, just be like, all right, whatever. We're just not going to comment on Ben and Jerry's not selling it. That would be the smart thing to do. We're just not going to comment so no one asks questions. But now people are like, now it's on the news. And people are like, okay, so why is Ben and Jerry's boycotting Israel? Is it because they're like horrible racist or horrible anti-Semitics? No, they're not anti-Semitic. They're so why are they doing it? Well, it's because there's apartheid and a lot of kind of horror and criminal activity going on in these occupied areas, and Oh, well, I didn't know that. Like, why would you even bring attention to it by kind of making this media scoop around it? People aren't going to stop eating Ben and Jerry's.
This kind of reminds me of like a different story that we can take as like the opposite side of the spectrum. You heard the story about Chick-fil-A recently? Like the
I think
story?
I've heard that there's always been stories about people like boycotting Chick-fil-A about the owner's stance
that
on
has something
gay
to do
marriage.
with it, but what so New York has a bunch of like rest stops along their freeways that they're building and stuff like that, and Chick-fil-A had a contract to create to invest their own private money into developing a restaurant on one of these rest stops in New York State. And apparently there's some, I don't know if it's a law or just like a guideline or something like that, that state money or like state contracts can't be awarded to anti-LGBTQ companies and things like that. And I'm not going to get too deeply into it because I'm not like the foremost expert on it, but there's been some questions about whether or not Chick-fil-A supported shit like Pray the Gay Away, because Truett Cathy, the founder of Chick-fil-A, was like pretty anti-gay and like stuff like that. So
there's actually a group called Pray the Gay Away.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, it's just
a
funny. It's not funny because of the homophobia. It's funny because
the
it's
actual
just,
practice is not
it's
funny,
just
but
funny.
It's a funny term.
It's like it's not that it's even a funny term. It's like making fun of an old redneck or something like that. It's just you're making fun of the actual bigotry because it's so kind of archaic that someone would think of that. But all right,
anyway,
I'm sorry.
So the opposite side of this spectrum here is that obviously there's no foreign government involved in this particular story, but there's this big backlash that's happening against New York State because Chick-fil-A is a private company, and Chick-fil-A also their stated goal or mission isn't to like be anti-LGBTQ and all this other stuff, and folks on the right are rallying to Chick-fil-A's defense of this, and they see it as like a I guess maybe this isn't as similar as I thought, but it's not quite freedom of speech or the curtailing of freedom of speech there, but it's like this private company that decides to take a stance or not take a stance in the case of Chick-fil-A, and how local governments and their policies can sometimes cause a little bit of stir the pot a little bit, depending on what side of the spectrum they fall on. And in this case of Ben and Jerry's, it seems like I'm going to take a wild guess and say that the majority of the 30 states that have anti-BDS movements are probably more conservative than the others, but I guess I wouldn't be surprised to see a bunch of liberal ones on there as well.
It's both, but most of them are red states, but it is both of it. It is just I absolutely think that is just, it's one of those things, even if you're not like, you don't care about the Israeli-Palestine conflict, or just don't really have a strong opinion on it, you have to have an opinion on a foreign state lobbying your state government on it. It is I just, it's a toxic relationship, and I think the Israeli government is really going to regret this in the long run, because it is just adding more exposure to what they're doing over there.
Yeah.
This show is sponsored by Ben and Jerry's, by the way. Just want to let you know. All right, we're gonna wrap this episode up. Thank you everyone for joining us for another episode of Bro History. I know it's been 2 weeks. We're back on track now. Episodes out every single Sunday. Thanks for your patience. If you want to support us, you can support us on by rating and reviewing our podcast. So rate and review the show. That is the number one way to help us grow. And you can also join us on our Patreon. Our Patreon is brohistory/Henry. Brohistory. Patreon/brohistory. It will be in the notes of the show. So join us on Patreon. extra content, Slack, communicate with us. We have a great community, and we will be putting out an episode for you next week. Peace.